Good morning. Welcome to the Point. This past week in Lansing, the state Senate started to take action to change the tax code here in Michigan to make it reflect the new tax law coming out of Washington. During this next half hour, we'll talk with both a Republican senator and a Democratic senator, explain that process and get their perspective about what's really going on. But it's important to note that there were two big votes taken, one about that tax fix and another about a veto override. Both of those were done unanimously, with all of the Republicans and all of the Democrats voting in favor. That's something that doesn't happen every week in Lansing. We talk first with the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, Senator Jim Ananich. Senator, it seems that in politics today, among other things, taxes are a big conversation. In Washington, they took steps to change the tax code, but when they did that, that changed Michigan's tax code a little bit. So tell me about the efforts in the Senate on that front. There are other fronts we'll talk about too, but first of all, restoring the exemption, the individual exemption here at the state.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a conversation that we've been having for a while. I even offered an increase in the personal exemption back in December on unrelated issues because I thought it was a time to give working families and middle-class families a tax break. So what we saw come from the Trump tax plan is that Michigan residents would have got about a $1.5 billion tax increase if we wouldn't have done something. So a lot of this talk about this being a massive tax cut for people just wasn't the case, right? I mean, we're seeing it on the state level for sure was going to raise people's taxes, and in many cases at the federal level it's going to raise people's taxes. So we came together. I spoke to Senator Brandenburg a week ago, and he was talking about doing the personal exemption, which obviously exempts a portion of the amount of taxes at the beginning before you pay any. And he expressed he wanted to raise it from $4,000 to $4,800. I told him I'd support that, and I try to bring my caucus along. And if he wanted to raise it, we could even do that and give people a real break. And that's what we ended up passing in the Senate recently with a $5,000 personal exemption. So we'll make sure that the Trump tax increase is revenue neutral here in Michigan, doesn't raise people's taxes, and we actually wanted to give some relief as well.
And to not get too far in the weeds, but so people understand, the exemption at the federal level changes from a personal exemption to a larger overall standard deduction.
Yeah.
And the merits of that can be debated
Sure.
out of Washington. But here, because our tax code was tied to the number of personal exemptions you took at the federal level,
Yeah.
you had to take some action at the
Yes.
state level, and in the process, you've made that larger. So that will have no impact on your federal taxes,
No.
but just here at the state.
Yeah, just your overall tax burden, right? When you're a working person, middle class person, no matter what your income is, you obviously care about how much tax you have to pay, and you don't always distinguish it between if you have a local tax or a state tax or a federal tax. So the federal tax, that's going to happen; those changes are going to happen one way or the other. State taxes were going to go up, so we wanted to make sure, and we thought that was a way to work in a bipartisan way, and my entire caucus supported it. Actually, everyone in the Senate voted for it.
And again, as the impact on the budget, that would have been found money.
Yes.
Had you allowed it to come in. So there may be a little loss of revenue because you have raised that exemption, but it's not like a big, broad impact on the budget.
No, and we made sure that there's a term called hold harmless. So the way our tax structure works, about 70% goes into the general fund, which funds like roads and things of that nature, and then the other 30% would go into the school aid fund. We didn't want to cut. We didn't want to have to make cuts to people's schools, so we held that harmless. It's about $200 million, and it sounds like a lot of money. Obviously, it is a lot of money to the individual taxpayer, but when a $56 billion budget, $200 million is not that hard to find. And I think we believe that we thought this is money that deserves to be in people's pockets.
Before we move on to the next issue, which is also a unanimous vote, I think, talk to me about the general attitude, because when it comes to something that big, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And when you get everybody on the same page, that tells me that things negotiated in the Senate are moving along pretty smoothly.
Well, I think, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Meekoff, and myself have a long established relationship. We don't always agree. We have different philosophies on a lot of things, and we've agreed on some things. And when we don't agree, we do it in a respectful way. But we try to be, I think both of us, and my caucus included, and I think their caucus, for the most part does as well, we come here for a reason, right? We come here to serve people. And so we had a lot of good conversations, and I think our caucus felt we needed tax relief, especially a more progressive tax relief that helped people of all income brackets, but it definitely helps people at the lower end and the middle spectrum better, more so than people at the higher end. It's a fair tax. It's a fair tax cut. It's equal across the board. Everyone gets the same amount. We thought that made a lot of sense, and the conversations went really well with the majority leader, and we were able to support Senator Brandenburg's bill and come out of there unanimously.
And when you talk about it being a fair tax, there was some conversation, and I know over in the House they continue to have the conversation about rolling the percentage back.
Yeah.
Democrats are less inclined to support that because of the disproportionate way that it impacts people.
Yeah, I mean, you look at like folks that are mega wealthy, some of their donors and things of that nature, they get a huge tax break. Where a regular person who gets up in the morning and maybe clocks in, maybe a teacher, maybe a small business owner, maybe somebody who works in a place, makes a good living but not feeling that they're overly secure right now, they may see a $20 tax cut. And $20 is $20 more they got, but I don't think they want to see their roads cut. I don't think they want to see their money for roads being cut. I don't think they want to see their schools get worse. So to us, it made sense to let's give everyone an equitable tax break. It's not going to be a lot of money, but at least it's the same across the board, and it's your money, you get to keep it. And as opposed to giving huge tax breaks to some people and little, pittance to other people, we're saying, everyone deserves a break, and we're going to give it to you.
You're kind of a student of politics, and so what happened here this week was historic to some degree, an override of the governor's veto in both chambers, and in the Senate, again, that was a unanimous vote. I described it thusly, you will correct me if I'm wrong, it is unique and historic because I think it was 4 times in 67 years or something like that. But it also was a little less dramatic because it was kind of a technical change. The idea that these tax cuts, if you consider them that, or reductions
Sure.
When it comes to cars, and I'll let you explain how that works, it was going to happen anyway. These bills just accelerated it by half.
Yeah.
So instead of being 20 years phase in, 10-year phase in. So it wasn't an argument about policy, it was about implementation. Still kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it's a real big deal. Yeah, I think, I was the first co-sponsor in both those bills. I actually spoke with both sponsors, and I was willing to sponsor one of them myself because I thought, sales tax on the difference basically means if you're trading in a car, instead of paying double tax on the trade-in car and the new car, you're paying sales tax on the difference. And a lot of folks in our state, obviously the economy, especially under President Obama, and continued to grow. People are finding work now. We have low unemployment, but a lot of folks just don't feel secure. They don't feel that at the end of the week that if something bad happens, that the next week they could be in dire straits. So, a lot of people have issues getting to work, and they need to get a new car, whether it's used or a new car. And to double tax, it's a bad tax in the first place. So to me, a bad tax is a bad tax. You don't need 20 years to fix a bad tax. Let's get it done as quickly as possible. And we came together and said, some things are just worth overriding the veto. And, to me, the governor was quick to pass those $1.8 billion in corporate tax breaks. He's given out, corporate, some people call it corporate welfare or things of that nature to give incentives to people. But we've done almost nothing. And in many cases, they've raised taxes on regular families, working families and middle-class families. And this was something that just seemed like a good break for people.
So one of the aspects of this that I find interesting is that this continues to increase by about $1,000 a year. Up until about $14,000. So that would be the max out, I guess. But this means, if I understand it, if I buy a $30,000 car and I have a car that's worth $10,000, I'm only going to pay taxes on the $20,000.
Yeah, as opposed to paying taxes on the new car and the old car when you bought it.
So you've already started with some legislative wins here for both Republicans and Democrats, I would guess, if everybody's voting yes on these bills. What would you like to see as this year goes forward? And in terms of that, by the time this airs, we'll only be a couple of days away from the governor's State of the State.
Yeah.
What would you like for him to talk about?
I'd even say, too, I think these were wins for Michigan taxpayers, right? I think sometimes we look at things too often as a Democratic issue or Republican issue. And I know it's the way the politics works, but really this was a real win and put more money back in the people's pockets. And I think we need to make sure we think about this, even though it's an election year. We need to make sure that we're here to serve people. And one of the things that I want to see us work on, and I think we have a responsibility to, you've been to Flint a number of times. Obviously that issue is its own, we don't have to talk about that, but we're seeing more water issues popping up, even in your viewership. You see the PFAS issue happening, and it's going to happen all over the state, unfortunately. And I think we have a responsibility, one, to make sure we give people accurate and transparent information. People need to make sure they know what's in their drinking water. And I think we should be leading the country on this. And we talked about it before we knew about these issues, and I wanted to make sure we were leading on lead. But I think in general, because of all of our access to Great Lakes, all of our, it's a great recreational state. I mean, pure Michigan. We need to make sure that when people come here, whether they live here or they're visiting, that they can safely feel that they're gonna have safe water coming, whether it's a well or a municipal system. And I think that's something that we can do together. This isn't politics, right? I mean, we got to make sure we have standards that protect people, process in place that we inform people earlier, and make sure people that do damage to our community have restitution. And I think that's something that I'm really hopeful that we tackle. We talked about it a little bit earlier, I believe. Infrastructure. I think everybody, wakes up in the morning, they go to the pump, they know they're paying more in taxes. When their birthday comes, they get a 40% increase in their registration, and the roads are getting worse. I mean, to me, that's something that has to be addressed. We have to address infrastructure in our state, because every day you don't fix it, it gets more and more expensive to fix in the future. And kicking the can down the road is something that's it's not responsible, and it needs to stop.
And when you talk about infrastructure, and I mean, the two kind of tie together, I mean, it is roads, yes, and that's something that we see, but all the stuff underneath the roads needs to be fixed too. There's a big infrastructure project right outside your window here that'll be going on for the next 2 years. But all over, we were talking about Kalamazoo and some of the problems that they've experienced with water mains. And Fraser and obviously in your hometown, this is all stuff that I think people agree needs to be done. The problem is going to be with the price tag, right?
Yep. And every day you wait on it, it's going to be more expensive. Really, this is something where, the shenanigans that are happening in Washington, D.C., they have to come together and find a solution, because we're not going to be able to pay for it all here. They're going to have to come up with an infrastructure plan in Washington, D.C. And I think, attacking different countries and calling them vulgar names and things of that nature, not dealing with CHIP and all these other issues, is a distraction. They need to get these issues resolved, and they need to start focusing on things that put men and women back to work all across this country, rebuilding our roads, rebuilding our water systems, rebuilding our dams and bridges, and partner with states to make sure we get this done. We have to do our part, because the state plan that was passed a few years ago, all it does is raise your taxes and made our roads worse. So we have to fix our part, but we also have to have Washington do their job too.
The Senate bill goes beyond what the governor had asked for, and even more than what's asked for over in the House. The Senate bill and the House bill will probably have to come together for some type of a compromise. That could happen perhaps as early as next week. We're back with a Republican take on all of this next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. This past week in Lansing, a couple of big votes, unanimous votes. You just heard from the leader of the Democrats. Now, one of the appropriations members, Senator Tanya Schuitmaker, a Republican from Lawton, talks about the process. Senator, let's talk about taxes. And this week over in your chamber, a couple of things happened that were pretty unusual. 2 unanimous votes, all the Democrats, all the Republicans voting together, both of them dealing with taxes. Let's start first with the veto override of a plan that will make it less taxing to buy a car, for example.
Right. It was sales tax on the difference. We were only one of 6 states that actually charge sales tax on the whole value of the car, regardless of what you traded in the vehicle for. And so we wanted to make sure that we gave tax relief to the families out there, especially considering that we're the automobile state.
And it comes at a time with the North American International Auto Show is underway, so the timing looked good. But for majority Republicans to overturn a Republican governor's veto, pretty unusual. I think according to one report, it's only 4 times in 67 years that it's been done at all. So this was a matter of not that the governor was opposed to reducing the tax, but he wanted the timing different.
He did want the timing different, and so we wanted it accelerated a little bit more. So there was just a policy difference. There's no disrespect to the governor. It's just really a simple fact that the legislature, this is one of the most important issues to it, and we kind of felt a little bit different.
When you think of day-to-day activity, and I've watched you throughout your career, and you've always had friends across the aisle. It's not like, I think some people have, and I think people like me and other political reporters helped foster the image that Republicans and Democrats are bunkered down and they don't talk to each other and there's no cooperation, which is not the case. But on something as big as an override and the next tax policy we're going to talk about, to get all of the Republicans and all of the Democrats, that's kind of unusual.
I think there was a broad consensus with Republicans and Democrats that we need to give the working person out there tax relief, and so I think that's why you saw both Republicans and Democrats come together and give tax relief to the working people out there in the state of Michigan.
Another issue that came up because of what Republicans, without any Democratic votes, in Washington did to change the tax code, and it inadvertently changed the tax code in Michigan because, if I understand it, and if I explain this poorly, I hope you'll bail me out here. But the idea was that on our tax form it says you can have the same amount of personal exemptions that you have on your federal tax chart. But at the federal level, they did away with those to make this big standard deduction, and so that left us with no place to put that number in. And you co-sponsored a bill that will deal with that.
I did. I co-sponsored it with Senator Brandenburg. And it was to bring, because you're exactly right, the state exemption was based upon the federal exemption. When the federal government based it down to zero, that kind of eliminated our exemption. So we wanted to give hardworking families that deduction back and make sure that there was no unintended consequences from what the federal government did. And while we did that, we also increased it. So it will be phased over time till 2021 up to $5,000. Right now, I believe it's at $4,200.
So that gives the federal tax implementation, the change in that federal tax, that makes it more or less revenue neutral. In other words, it doesn't change. The other way around, it would have made you pay more in state taxes if you didn't have that.
That's correct. Yeah. If you didn't amend it to fix that unintended consequences with the federal government bringing the exemption down to zero, it was going to have a tax consequence to the hardworking families out there, and so we wanted to make sure that we ensured it.
And we should point out that that's the original Senate bill. There's an original House bill, and at some point the two will probably converge, and there may be some changes made, but it seems almost certain, at least to me as an observer, that that kind of tax relief is going to happen.
Absolutely. Right now it's at $4,200. The governor proposed $4,500. The House proposed $4,800, and the Senate proposed $5,000. So somewhere in the difference, I think all three leaders will get together and determine it's one of those.
Does this follow? And I realize again, because of the nature of the two things happening, the veto that of the Senate bills 94 and 95, I think they were that. That you dealt with, and also this exemption because of the federal tax law. But very early on in this term for the House, they were very focused on tax relief and tried several different mechanisms and really didn't get very far with it at all. But is this kind of satisfy, and perhaps you can't answer this for the House, but does this kind of satisfy the desire on the part of many, particularly Republicans, who have been talking about tax relief for a while?
Well, this certainly is a good first step. Certainly, we can always do something to make sure that every tax dollar that the state takes in is spent wisely and judiciously. So we want to make sure that, and I think that's what our people that we represent want and expect of us. And so when you've seen an increase in year after year in terms of the budgets, a lot of people that I've been talking to have said, you know, when is it going to come back to, rather than grow government, to really focus on, you know, giving us some money back. And so this is a good first step. Hopefully the conversation continues. Hopefully revenues continue to come in and we can do all the things that the state is required of the state government, fund our schools, fund our roads, and also provide tax relief.
Let's look ahead. The governor is going to deliver his final State of the State on Tuesday night, and while he will lay out his priorities for his final year in office, your final year as a state senator, and many of your colleagues, what would you like to hear him talk about? What would be unfinished business for you before your time in the Senate is done?
You know, we've accomplished so much. Certainly, the one thing that I look forward to tackling is I've got some bills out there dealing with a statewide definition of truancy. I've always believed that if you keep kids in school, you'll stop the prison to or school to prison pipeline, and I think that's a really important standard, and that's one of the last things I'd like to see done. So hopefully he mentions that. And I think we've done a lot in the state of Michigan. When I came into the Senate, as you know, the unemployment rate was over 15%. Now it's a little bit above 4%. And so there's been a lot of important things that we've done. And so I think the governor has done a good job at leading the state for the last 7 years.
In terms of the possible, this is an election year. And for so many folks that serve with you, they're in their final year. For so many people over in the House that are running for the Senate, and all of the atmosphere surrounding that, is it possible? I mean, obviously you got some things done early, but as the year goes on, does it get more difficult to get real policy done given the atmosphere that starts to create the competition?
You know, some may say that. I would also argue that with having a term-limited Senate, that a lot of people still have a lot of things to get done. And with the clock ticking on 1 year and less, then I would imagine that you'll start to see a huge rush on that. And then we also have one final budget year to do. And as appropriations members, we all are working very hard to accomplish that.
You know, you mentioned earlier, we talked about the ever-growing budget, and it always has gotten bigger despite the fact there's always talk about making government smaller. When you look at revenues versus spending, obviously in far better shape than those nights when you were over in the House and stayed all night long trying to come up with anything that would balance a budget. Are we on a track for Michigan to avoid some of those pitfalls that we saw, even if the economy slows down, which inevitably it will? I mean, the cycles are still there. Is the budget more structurally sound than when you came in?
Absolutely, it's more structurally sound. No longer are we passing on a $1.5 billion unfunded liability, which was, they were robbing Peter to pay Paul when I was in the House. We have a structurally sound budget. We have a lot more money in our rainy day fund. I think it's up to $900 million in our rainy day fund. And when I came in, it was, it ran state government for a day or two, and that was it. So I think there's a lot to say that we've made Michigan's budget a lot more structurally sound.
Going to your last budget cycle, knowing that this is going to be implemented and then you'll leave office and other people will be here to deal with it, is it more difficult to estimate or think about the revenues, or is it really just the same process?
I think it's really just the same process that we've always put together, dealing with the estimates as we get them from very talented people that usually are pretty accurate and based upon the economy and where they see car sales, which is a huge driver in our economy, as you know. So unless there's some cataclysmic, event out there that is unforeseen, I think that the revenues will be very close to what they are projected at, and the next legislature will have a lot of peace of mind at knowing that we've passed on to them. And this governor has been very supportive that he wants to make sure that he leaves the state of Michigan in a much better place. And I share that same concern with him. That we have come in and we've put more money in our state's rainy day fund. We have gotten rid of the structural imbalance. We've made good fiscal use of the taxpayers' dollar. And so I think that the next legislature will be very thankful for the decisions that we've made, not only this year, but also the past 7 years.
So as we enter into the final year for Governor Rick Snyder, he has suffered his first veto override. This coming week, he's going to talk about his plan for the new year, and we'll talk about that when we come back to the point. So this week, Governor Rick Snyder will deliver his final State of the State address. In that, he'll outline his plans for his final year in office. We'll be in Lansing on Tuesday night to tell you what's on his mind, what to expect for the coming year. See you next week.